Welcome to another edition of Dan Frequently Asked Questions, in which we deal with issues of immediate concern to divers. In this edition, we'll be talking about inner ear problems after diving. Now, in this case, we have a diver's wife who explains that her husband, after diving on an unknown mixture to an unknown depth, but in a dry suit, so we can assume that it was cold water, at 15 feet or 3 meters, developing vertigo or a sense of dizziness and nausea. This continued during the remainder of the ascent and even after the dive for a period of 30 minutes or longer, and in fact went on into the rest of the day and even the next day. Upon that, it was followed by pain in the external ear, and their question is, what could this be and what might have caused it? Well, there are a number of things we don't know about the dive. As I mentioned, we don't know how deep it was, we know the water was cold, we don't know to what extent the dive profile was followed, but what is important is that there was an onset of symptoms during ascent, and already while the individual was relatively shallow. Now, there are essentially 5 types of vertigo related to the ear that we recognize with diving. They may be middle ear barotrauma. Usually when the person descends, the ear bursts and the cold water causes a caloric response, and the person feels dizzy for a while until the water heats, and then they basically go back to normal, even though they may be blowing bubbles out of their ear. Secondly, it may be the result of an inner ear barotrauma event where they forced their ears, and as a result there was damage to the inner ear. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be so bad that it becomes a fistula, which is another form of inner ear barotrauma, where there actually is a rupture of typically the round window and sometimes the oval window. So those are 2 types, but those are associated with forcing the ear. And then there's a situation of so-called alternobaric vertigo. Now, alternobaric vertigo is a form of reverse block where a person ascends, and usually when they're around 5 meters, there is a slight difference in the pressure of the middle ear because the one Eustachian tube allowed air or gas out more readily than the other. Because that causes a slight difference in the anatomy of the inner ear, it may cause the one inner ear to be a little bit more active than the other and create the sensation of vertigo. The important hallmark is that as soon as those pressures equalize, typically within 10 minutes, often within seconds after reaching the surface, it's gone. However, if it lasts more than 30 seconds to 10 minutes, then one has to consider one of the other issues. Now, we don't have any history of forceful equalizing or problems equalizing. We do, however, know that it was a fairly deepish dive, we presume, in coldish water, and that the symptoms occurred during ascent and they persisted after ascent. Now, in the absence of any other history, the diagnosis would probably be by preference or differential diagnosis, could be any of the 5, but the primary differential diagnosis would be inner ear decompression illness. And when anybody has dived deeper than 80 feet or 24 meters, then it is possible to accumulate sufficient inert gas that it may form bubbles in the inner ear, and that then causes inner ear decompression illness. That is not to say that this wasn't a case of inner ear barotrauma, but in lieu of any other information, we would have to say this sounds very suspicious of a case of inner ear decompression illness, compounded maybe the second day with an external otitis when there was perhaps sensitivity or infection of the external ear. Either way, I would strongly encourage this individual to seek medical advice and preferably even see an ENT as quickly as possible to determine what the issues are. In previous years, we sometimes were led to believe that if you didn't start treating a diver within an hour of developing vertigo following ascent and presumably decompression illness, it would have no effect. Nowadays, we know that we can have delays of even more than a day, and there may still be a benefit, because the mechanisms involved in the early days are different than ones that we see today. So I hope that's answered your question, and if it hasn't, please just fill in the blanks of what we don't know, and we can maybe elaborate on that more on email. So please just email us either on info@dancer.org or medic@dancer.org, and we'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you for asking and for joining us on Dan Frequently Asked Questions.